We will begin with the presentation of the Competitive Network Operators of Canada. Please introduce yourself and your colleagues, and you may begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairperson Atreides, Vice Chairperson Scott, Commissioners Desmond and Naidoo, and Commission staff. My name is Chris Tassett, founder of Tassett Law. I would like to begin by acknowledging that those of us who are gathered here today are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, and I pay respect to them and their elders. With me are Paul Anderson, cnoc Chair and President and the President of eGate Networks, Ian Stevens, cnoc Vice Chair and the Chief Executive Officer of Execulink Telecom, Stuart Cattrall of Tassett Law, and Dr. Ziki Chen, Professor of Economics at Carleton University. Also assisting us and sitting behind us is Chris Copeland of Tassett Law. Mr. Anderson will now read our opening statement.
I am excited to join you and represent cnoc's membership to support the Commission's work on making the Internet more affordable for Canadians. We're here to speak directly to you about how companies like ours help lower prices and improve service to Canadians when the right regulatory frameworks are in place. Since even before the Internet became mainstream, both Ian and I promoted the value that the Internet could bring to transform our daily lives. Our companies have for decades provided Canadians affordable competition for telecom services. Competitors in the Canadian telecom sector bring choice and affordable alternatives to the entrenched incumbents. Our members, independent enterprises, have stepped up and for a time brought market discipline to some of the largest companies in this country. Today's basic offerings, like unlimited bandwidth wireline plans and high-touch customer service standards, were spearheaded by competitors in Canada. While the regulatory landscape never totally solidified, independent telecom competitors have leveraged the wholesale access framework to accomplish these feats. Despite these successes, the lack of regulatory certainty has meant that affordability and competition crisis in Canadian telecom remains a pressing issue for the people and businesses of Canada. Fortunately, we have a path forward. The Commission must maintain its current trajectory towards a more open and competitive telecom sector in Canada by mandating aggregated wholesale access to incumbent-owned fiber-to-the-premise, or FTTP, networks. In this presentation, we will talk about the current stakes facing competitors, counter incumbent myths, and offer strategies to optimize the competition policies going forward. These include clarity on who can and can't use wholesale access regime, determining more accurate wholesale rates, and improving overall quality of service. I'd like to review the crisis facing service-based competition in Canada. The Commission recently determined in 2023-358 that the disaggregated wholesale high-speed access framework, meant to provide retail competition over FTTP networks, failed to achieve its goals. Disaggregated access saw minimal adoption since its introduction in 2015, and the Commission determined it was not effectively supporting competition due to the complexity and persistent barriers to entry endured by cnoc members. This means independent internet service providers lack a practical way to access FTTP technology as its deployment exploded. As the Commission found, telephone companies have rapidly expanded fiber-to-the-premise networks, reaching over 60% of Canadian homes. However, without this aggregated wholesale access, independent ISPs cannot meet the growing demand for the service quality and reliability of FTTP networks. The consequences of this difficult environment underscore the state of competition. As shown in recent market data discussed in 2023-358, independent ISP subscriber bases have sharply declined. They've lost nearly 40% of subscribers nationally and almost half in Ontario and Quebec since late 2020. Multiple acquisitions of long-standing successful cnoc members by incumbent providers in recent years further reduced competitive forces. Unless the Commission acts swiftly to address the lack of functional wholesale fiber access cited in the previous decision, independent ISPs risk irrelevance as incumbent market power continues to fester. Decisive regulatory intervention is required to end the crisis and maintain independent ISPs as viable competitors. While we welcome the interim decision in Ontario and Quebec, it did not remedy the crisis plaguing independent ISPs across the entire country. As cnoc has argued before, without a final policy establishing a nationwide, aggregated fiber access, service-based competition faces a collapse that could leave Canadian consumers with little choice. Independent ISPs face an existential threat as incumbent companies often replace aging copper and coaxial networks with direct fiber connection. This transition shrinks the competitor's potential customer pool, with each new neighborhood, apartment building, or block converted. Evidence shows incumbent deployments are pushing independent ISPs from previously served territories. If left unaddressed, the replacement of copper facilities will render the majority of Canadian homes and businesses inaccessible to competitors. The Commission cannot risk delaying its actions based on perceived or anticipated implementation issues, which could be dealt with at a later date. The evidence presented around the decline in competitive intensity and the loss of subscriber share to incumbents shows that we cannot wait any longer to implement a national, permanent, aggregated regime. Incumbents need to take steps to implement the policy as quickly as possible and require direction to that effort so they can quickly make the information technology and information system changes now. I'd like to discuss a few important aspects of a successful policy now. In Regulatory Policy 2015-326, the Commission defined FTTP as, quote, the fiber optic access facility connecting an individual customer premise to a central office or head end, end quote. This ensures all fiber networks and technologies are included in the wholesale access regime. The Commission must be vigilant to reject any incumbent tactics that might seek to exclude any services that meet the Commission's definition of FTTP. It is also important that an aggregated access is mandated at a level that makes practical sense. Aggregated access involves incumbents implementing interconnection at centralized regional locations at a geographic level no smaller than a provincial-wide basis. These access points should be in practical locations served by competitive transport options. These changes would address some of the challenges cnoc members experienced with the disaggregated regime. All major incumbent telecom providers referred to in this proceeding should be obligated to offer aggregated fiber access rights to their full footprint. This will make sure competitive options from cnoc members would reach consumers across Canada, no matter their location. Certain use restrictions are also necessary. Incumbents and their affiliates should be blocked from wholesale access within their territories to maintain investment incentives between rivals. A more comprehensive restriction that applies both in territory and out of territory must apply to the three national carriers, Rogers, Bell, and TELUS. This is necessary due to their demonstrated dominance across multiple wireless and wireline telecom markets that enables them to bundle services more effectively and coordinate prices in a manner that could harm competition. These limitations seek to safeguard competitive vibrancy while still protecting existing customers and incumbent incentives to invest during any transition. We acknowledge that implementing these restrictions will require a transition period. Consistent with the objective of not negatively impacting the consumer, we propose that incumbents would not be permitted to add new subscribers following the Commission's decision in this proceeding if doing so would violate one of these restrictions, but existing subscribers would not be affected. We've already talked about how an in-territory restriction on incumbent use of wholesale HSA access will help preserve incentives to invest. And I would like now to discuss the topic of investment a bit more. You've heard the incumbents say that a wholesale access regime will impede investment incentives. This is a myth, and the threats of reduced investments are not credible for a number of reasons. Companies that are building fiber networks will realize long-term investments and returns as the technology has a long life cycle to benefit consumers and shareholders for decades. Because of the nature of telecommunications business, the inherent drive among facilities-based incumbents to upgrade their networks for competitive advantage exists independent of a mandated wholesale access. Moreover, cnoc is not proposing that companies gain access for free. Companies that build networks should be entitled to a reasonable return on their investment that is sufficient to incentivize further investments. The Commission's decision in 2023-196 found that incumbents receive a reasonable return on their investments under the Phase 2 costing methodology. And the significant public funding for telecommunications infrastructure in underserved, Indigenous communities, or commercially unviable areas further undermines the credibility of incumbents' investment threats. As well, a recent opinion from the Federal Court of Appeal denying a stay of the Commission's order to implement a temporary access regime noted that Bell failed to provide concrete evidence that the Commission's decision to mandate temporary access would cause irreparable harm to the company. The Federal Court also found that Bell's choice to redirect or cut investment dollars was seen as a business decision and not as an inevitable consequence of the Commission's ruling, suggesting that any potential harm was within Bell's control. The current challenge facing the Commission is the appropriate pricing of wholesale access rates for incumbent networks. The previously determined rates for wholesale HSA access remains significantly above incumbent retail market offerings. This contributes to the ongoing collapse of service-based competition across Canada. Only one of the following two scenarios can be true. Either the incumbents are engaged in below-cost retail pricing that has anti-competitive effects, or the current wholesale rates are too high and need to be lowered by the Commission to ensure they are just and reasonable. In Decision 2023-196, the Commission required incumbents, when making rate-setting applications, to provide market-level information that should include, quote, the equivalent standalone retail rates, promotion and win-back retail rates, comparison to rates for similar services in other countries, and any other related relevant information. Because of the information asymmetry inherent in the rate-making process, the market-level information must be provided as a sanity check against rates developed using the Phase 2 process. Otherwise, the Commission risks setting rates that are not just and reasonable and will prevent service-based competitors from effectively competing. In addition, we urge the Commission to return to its practice adopted in its previous FTTN rate review of ensuring that incumbents do not deviate from any Phase 2 requirements and related disclosure rules whenever they file cost studies. This will result in a more effective and efficient review process and will make it possible for interveners to make more meaningful submissions, resulting in a more complete and timely record. cnoc members have long expressed frustrations at the state of quality of service issues facing competitors to the incumbents, due to the incumbents' involvements on competitors' customers' onboarding and technical support process. We suggest two main changes to the quality of service reporting regime to address this term, namely requiring the incumbents to file quality of service metrics for their retail operations and instituting an enforcement mechanism such as a rate rebate plan. cnoc submissions include many technical and process improvements to wholesale services that are designed to eliminate artificial costs and barriers to competition, and these negatively impact the affordability and quality of telecommunication services available to our customers and thus Canadian consumers. We believe that this list of proposed improvements is important, but we recognize that the need to focus on launching aggregated fiber as quickly as possible is the priority. Therefore, we are proposing the Commission appoint a Commissioner as an inquiry officer to examine the issue of technical and quality of service improvements to wholesale services. This inquiry should include informal industry consultations and culminate in a report and recommendation for improvements to wholesale services, which can then be implemented. Chairperson Atreides, Vice Chairperson Scott, Commission Desmond, and Naidoo, thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning on behalf of companies working tirelessly every day to make the internet more affordable and accessible to Canadians. This week, you've heard from the voices of those who care deeply about the state of telecommunications in Canada. It is a critical sector to living, working, and participating in society. It should be affordable and accessible to all, with choice and quality being determined through service competition instead of relying on duplication of expensive networks. But our last message to you is clear. Time is of the essence. Canadians need access to affordable internet services. eGate, Execulink, and other members in Ontario and Quebec, are ready to bring affordable, innovative telecom services when the initial aggregated wholesale access framework is in place on May 7th. We are excited to bring this choice to Canadians. Nonetheless, true competition will only be sustainable when an effective national permanent framework comes into fruition. Thank you for the opportunity to make the submissions. This concludes my presentation, and we'd be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you very much to cnoc for being here today, for sharing your perspectives. You've covered a lot of ground in the opening remarks, and I know we have a lot of questions, and we look forward to the discussion around a lot of the issues that you have raised. I will turn things over to Vice Chair Scott to start with the questioning for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, cnoc. Why don't we start with a quick tour of the country, because I'm interested in knowing why the various regions of Canada see such a varied level of wholesale-based competition. And I'm thinking particularly of BC and Alberta, where it's never really gotten off the ground, and where we're seeing relatively high ARPU that I would think would be an attractive target to wholesale competitors.
Sure, I'll start it off and then ask my colleagues to join in. There's a lot of factors, I suspect, in that, which we kind of touched in the opening statement. First, I think it goes to that addressable market concern we said. TELUS has been very aggressive at their fiber deployments, which means as a competitor, I only have access to the DSL, which are not the speeds that people are looking for on the residential, given that the speeds are just not the same as you see on coax. And when we look at Shaw, who's the major player in that area, now Rogers Shaw, they had a bit of a mini disaggregated element there where you had 11 interconnection points that you're now going to have to build 22 connections to because you're going to want some redundancy, and they're not in good locations. Also, that service improvement list really plays key here because we see the telcos being sometimes a little bit more mature in their technology. There's a lot of manual processes in a lot of those carriers, and that adds to cost if we have to, because of the labor factor. So I think what you're seeing is just a model that's rolled out that's just very difficult to attract to. And then when we look at the prairies, again, there's very complex interconnections between SaskTel and MTS. You need multiple interconnections. The aggregation point is not in a logical place with competitive transfer, and that just all adds to cost. And when you're looking at the addressable market that you can hit, it's just low. I'll turn it over to Chris to maybe add some items.
Thank you. Well, there's a few other considerations, one of which is actually the way that the regulator has approached this in part, and that is because market shares have tended to be a little higher in Ontario and Quebec for competitors, there tends to be a lot more focus on stoking that and improving that, whereas the other markets, because they're seen as less competitive, there tends to be the belief that they shouldn't get as much attention because there isn't a competitive pressure. But I think that can be a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would suggest that in order to make sure that competition is more even across the country, the Commission should pay attention particularly to the weaker areas, all of them, but should actually pay more attention to those that need to be leveled up to central Canada.
Yeah, Mr. Taz, I know you said you have a list, but on exactly this point before you move on.
Sure.
So I think that kind of stoking argument, I think, could definitely be a description of our last interim decision. Prior to that, are there other decisions that you think exhibited the same phenomenon?
Well, yeah, even though the disaggregated model ended up not working well, it was developed first in Ontario and Quebec. So there tends to be a lot of focus on that. It's undeniable that when you when you look at population, there's more concentration and so on. So those numbers can be skewed. I guess our belief is that if we can overcome some of these obstacles, like for example, the multiple POIs in out west in Shaw territory, even under an aggregated regime, 11 POIs is a lot. If disaggregated isn't working, that needs to be fixed. And not be careful not to listen to arguments like SaskTel makes that, oh, well, it's so small here, you shouldn't bother with it. It's quite the opposite. If it's small there, then conditions actually need to be improved. I think Stuart may have some more comments as well.
Thank you, Chris. The only thing I'd like to add to what Chris was saying is we've seen suggestions in some of the submissions that, for example, that Atlantic Canada, everything is fine there. We want to caution with the data that we've seen on Atlantic Canada. It seems to suggest that a significant amount of the Bureau's analysis, for example, was focused on competition in a single CMA, and that CMA was, filed in confidence, but logically we assumed that they were talking about Halifax. And we just want to caution that, for example, when you're looking at competition in the Atlantic region, it's a big region. We're talking about Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. So any kind of suggestions, for example, that things are fine in Atlantic Canada, we would suggest that, you need to look outside that entire CMA as well. And also that we are not suggesting that everything is fine because, you have the same kind of structural issues there with lack of access to aggregated FTTP.
Great, thank you for that. In your submission, you said that wholesale FTTP will lead to greater choice for consumers in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. You highlighted that specifically. I'm interested in knowing to what extent your members serve those communities now, and beyond your general recommendations with regards to imposing aggregated FTTP wholesale, do you have any other specific asks of us that would support those communities in particular?
I'll let Chris start off on this one.
Well, I guess you know if they serve or not, but in terms of the policy aspect of this, I think you have a broadband fund, obviously targeting some of those funds as much as possible to those areas helps. We hope that other governmental institutions do likewise. There is no question that there are some areas in Canada that will not receive the benefits of FTTP without some government assistance and subsidy. It's just not economic. So in those areas, there has to be assistance. But that, we want to caution that shouldn't be the reason for not mandating FTTP. There's a little bit of a danger here of having the tail wag the dog in the regulatory sense, in that if the Commission focuses on the hard-to-reach areas or the shrinking areas where it's still feasible to do it, but it just hasn't happened yet, and that determines policy, we take away choice for consumers throughout Canada. And so I would just urge that balance has to be struck very, very carefully, and that you not necessarily pay as much attention to the sky is falling scenarios that some of the large incumbents are putting forward to you, because it is a much more nuanced balance than that.
So to answer the question, yes, we do have members that have, and ones that did. Unfortunately, some of them were required. Distributel did a lot of work in Indigenous communities, did a large lot there. Our organization serves, we're a national player in that we serve from coast to coast, so we have service locations in all 10 provinces and 3 territories on a B2B play. But yeah, we do have members that definitely are in rural. In fact, I'll turn over to one that's right beside me.
Yeah, so at ExecuLink, we have historically focused on small communities, southwestern Ontario. When we used wholesale and DSL was the platform of choice, it would reach outside of the villages and reach into onto the back roads into the rural areas, and that's the only technology that's available to them today. So those consumers have choice between DSL, or they are seeking other opportunities with fixed wireless or other options like that. But as the networks roll out and get deeper and deeper into these markets, those consumers are looking for choice, and they're looking for high-speed options as well. So when we look at a national framework, we don't think that carving those rural and remote areas out of the footprints of the incumbents makes sense if we want to give choice to consumers. And I think you heard that in the far north proceeding, that those folks up there who only had one choice were absolutely desperate for an alternative.
And Ian, I recall that you've actually built out in some of those areas, haven't you?
Yeah, so we have built out fiber networks ourselves, and it's typically small towns. Some you might consider big. I'd consider Ingersoll and Strathroy, places like that, big. But we also do small villages with a flashing light as its most extensive traffic control device, and up and down back roads. And we've also done First Nations communities as well.
Great, thank you. So I've been asking my Goldilocks questions all week, and for 4 days, people have been telling me that the porridge is too hot. I think today I'm going to hear that the porridge is too cold. So I'm interested in your take on the question, which really is, is there a wholesale rate for FTTP that allows the network operator to recover their costs and earn a reasonable return that incents investment, while still creating enough space for you to buy the service, sell the service, and put an offer into the market that benefits Canadians?
All right, I'm going to take a deep breath because I feel very nervous, because if I wasn't prepared for this question, I've clearly not been paying attention. I guess first, before I turn over to some of my colleagues, I just said a little bit, like, we talk about just and reasonable, but, and as I said, we've never asked for a free ride. That we sometimes, we need facilities in order to provide service-based competition. It doesn't make, it's not going to be a great business model if these facilities don't exist. But I think we have to talk about the current rates set for a second before we talk about this Goldilocks. And I appreciate the speed that the Commission has been going on this process, but if we look at the rates, wholesale tariff rates available to competitors today, if you look at the FTTN, you had the rate decision in 2019 that was overturned, and at that point, the Commission did say that those rates were not correct, and the choice was not to do anything about that. But in a low-margin game, we have rates that we know are too high. And on fiber, the only access rates currently are interim, and as was pointed out yesterday, are in some cases 3 times the cost of prices in the market. So without that, I think we first have to say is that we're looking for you to take that attempt and give us that phase 2 rate, which we believe will produce the true cost and should meet this Goldilocks. But if you buy on this precision point and that it's hard to hit this precision point, I believe we would prefer you err on the side of too low. And I think the reason is what happens to adjustment if you make a rate and then you realize that you have to make an adjustment. If you err on the rate of too high, I think you see further decline in a market. And I point out that a lot of the companies that were acquired were 30-year-old companies. Like, these were not flash in the pan. Sometimes were labeled as transient or short-term, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. These are organizations that are built, and they take time to build. So that's why we would urge you to err on the side of hit that precision point, but not go to keep going. I'll turn over to Chris as to why we do think phase 2, though, solves your Goldilocks.
So I'm going to answer your question in 2 parts. The first is, what are the sort of guardrails that exist to inherently keep you within the Goldilocks zone? And then how does phase 2 address the calibration of rates so that you can be confident you're in that zone, and where in that zone should you be? So first of all, as Paul said, the risks of rates being too high is much worse than the risk of rates being too low. So if that was a temporary condition, we've seen since 2021 with the acquisition of a number of very large and significant competitors. I think it was Cogeco that said that half of their wholesale business is now other incumbents. Well, that's not incumbents who directly signed up. That's the acquisitions. So there's a huge loss of that capacity. Why did that happen? It happened because after 2021, those companies received the signal that it was unlikely going forward into coming years that they would have a good business case. So they exited quickly. So you saw a very rapid response that diminished competition from rates being perceived to be too high. On the other hand, if rates are too low, even if there are investment consequences, they are much slower and they're smaller. So there is a lot of time to adjust. So if, for example, Bell or TELUS says to you, well, we're going to delay these projects, they're not really stopping investment. They're just slowing down temporarily. Bell Canada is not going to go bankrupt if wholesale rates are too low. So in terms of that calibration, we just want to urge caution as to how you perceive directionally the perils. And I think Dr. Chen has something, and then I'll continue.
Finished.
Oh, I'll finish. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the other, what are the disciplines then on investment so that we don't end up in trouble? Well, first of all, the incumbents have an incentive to invest. It's always been the case that from a platform perspective, the ILECs and the cable carriers have competed vigorously. And although cable carriers have found ways and continue to find ways to use their hybrid fiber coax plant, and now they're going to be going to DOCSIS 4, as you heard, they're still improving their technology. So in their case, they found a way to leverage that to increase speeds to ways that the ILECs can only do with FTTP. This is going to continue. Nothing you do on wholesale rates is going to diminish that. The other thing is the in-territory restriction that we have proposed serves as a discipline on that as well to ensure that incumbents don't just start relying on each other's infrastructure instead. And by the way, that restriction has another collateral benefit, which is that it kind of blunts the need for a regulatory holiday as well. The other thing, as I said earlier, is that there are areas that won't be built without a subsidy. And again, you know, policy shouldn't be driven by that. The stuff that hasn't been built is shrinking quite a bit. And finally, others will invest. If Bell or the objective here isn't to guarantee Bell or TELUS or Rogers or anyone else a rate of return. It's to make sure that consumers are served. And in some cases, and you saw Ian talk about where incumbents were slow to act, there was room for other parties to come in and build. Now I'm going to turn to the specific rate-making aspect of this. So in Phase 2, the cost of capital is specifically accounted for when you build up your Phase 2 costs. So in other words, every one of those costs actually includes a rate of return for the incumbent. And there are two parts to that. There's a cost of debt with changes over time, and so every time they file a study, that cost of debt may be different than it was last time. But the cost of equity has been constant for the ILECs since 1998, and for the cable carriers since 2000. Now, what's important about that? We all know that incumbents aren't shy about advocating when they think something in costing is wrong. We haven't heard them complain about the cost of equity embedded in Phase 2 studies. We haven't seen Part 1 applications saying, help us, we're desperate. If you don't increase our cost of equity, we won't be able to invest. Suggests to me that if anything, they may be overcompensated, but they're certainly not undercompensated. And finally, on the point of the rates, after you establish the Phase 2 costs and add them all up together, there is a markup applied on top of that, and right now it's 30%. So that's in addition to the buildup of costs, which inherently already includes the cost of capital of the incumbent. Now that markup, the purpose of it, is supposed to contribute to the fixed and common costs of the incumbent. So every organization has to recover its overhead, so to speak. So the Commission has said, well, these services must also make a contribution to that overhead, if you will. And the 30% figure was chosen. And that, we think actually that figure is high, and we're actually excited about the fact that you're going to have a follow-up proceeding in which we're going to get a chance to test that out. But what I do want to caution is, please don't use that markup to deal with so-called incentive, investment incentives. Any investment incentives should be addressed through the cost of capital building up phase 2 costs, not through this arbitrary markup that isn't related to financial conditions in any way. And finally, on this, I've got just one little point left, and then I will take a breath. But benchmarking. You found in 2023-196 that retail benchmarking is important. And I would encourage you to really use that. And I don't want it to be used in a way that turns the regime into a retail minus. That's not the point. The point is to use it as a sanity check. And why is that important? The reason that's important is because there is a tremendous information asymmetry between what the incumbents know about their costs, what you know, and what we know, who also have to live with a lot of hash marks for confidential information. I could say a little bit more about the asymmetry aspect, but I know this has been a long response, so I'll quit at this point unless you're interested in hearing more.
Can I?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to offer a theoretical answer to the question. So does such Goldilocks rates exist? My answer is yes. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know that because the incumbents are making investments and offering these services. Presumably when they decide to move forward with services, they've done their homework, they've did their calculations, they figured that these services will generate enough revenue for them to recover the costs and also earn a reasonable rate of return, and possibly more. And if you think about the wholesale, the principle behind the phase 2 wholesale rate setting, the methodology, then that's basically the same idea. It's based on the same idea. The idea is that the rates will be at such a level that the service providers will be able to recover their costs, incremental costs, as well as the earn a reasonable rate of return. So that's why I believe the answer is yes.
Great, thanks very much for that. Rogers also said yes, and they, less theoretical, they pointed specifically to the TPIA rates as quote unquote working. To what extent do you think the TPIA rates are at least working well enough to prove that the Goldilocks zone exists?
I don't know if we would agree with that, and maybe just ask Ian to kind of walk through, I think, some oversimplifications they're giving you in terms of that rate, Ian?
Sure. So I guess around the FTTN TPIA service, they're suggesting that it works. And there's, I guess, a couple components to the service. And the first one is the access rates, in which there's this fudge factor that they're using to try to influence the retail rate based upon a service that I don't believe has, and I'll let these guys get into the costing components of it, where they have different price points for the access. And then there's the CBB. And CBB is a bit funny. CBB is this hidden thing that we haven't heard a lot talked about this week. So when I connect a customer on Rogers TPIA service, I have to have a few cost components, and it's the access, and then I buy the connection from my network to Rogers, and I buy capacity on that network, and it's called CBB. And on a gig customer, 18 months ago, when I did my last CBB usage study to do my costing, the CBB component of the service was $12. Well, it doesn't sound like a lot. It's for a gig customer, it's access plus $12 of CBB. But the challenge with CBB is that not for 5 years, not for 10 years, but for 20 years, the demand that customers consume every year, every 18 months doubles. So 18 months ago when I did this study, it was $12. It's $24 today. And in 3 years' time, it's $100. In another 3 years, it's $400. So, you know, the Goldilocks number from yesterday may have made sense, but we're charging down a path with higher speeds and increasing demand, and CBB is the silent killer that's going to demolish our industry. I think Paul was going.
No, I was going to, Chris wants to add a bit, so.
Yeah, sorry, on that point, in one of the questions you've been asking is why are service-based competitors focusing on the lower speeds instead of the higher speeds? This is a good part of that answer. Usage-sensitive rates. So I want to just take a moment to explain for that CBB is based on peak capacity of the pipe. That's what it measures. It's not an amount, but it's based on peak capacity. And usage-sensitive costs have been falling in the industry, which means that you get bigger pipes with bigger capacity that handle bigger peaks at a lower cost per gigabit per second. The problem is that the CBB rates have not kept up with that in terms of declining quickly enough. And that is causing these squeezes, which limits independent service-based competitors' ability to service the highest speed customers. So that was an important point. I think Ian also touched on sort of value pricing in wholesale rates, and I'd like to just take a moment to talk about that. Wholesale services should be an agnostic input that go into retail services regardless of how the independent service-based competitor wants to use them. If we force fit the wholesale service provider's business model in the wholesale rate structure, all we're doing is forcing the independent service provider to mimic the business model of the incumbent, and that doesn't provide the choice. And there are historical examples where the Commission started doing this and then realized it shouldn't and veered course. One was going from UBB to CBB. The other was eliminating the markup differences in wholesale rates between, based on whether they were used for residential or business use. And so I would caution you when the cable carriers come to you and say, well, we need to have these rate bands because it reflects our retail market conditions and you've got to protect our business model, to not really heed that, because that is not sound from an economic perspective. The cost is what the cost is. If the phase 2 cost drives you to a single rate for a very broad set of speeds, then so be it. There shouldn't be any artificial building in of retail considerations or so-called value-add considerations.
So just to sum up, like I said, and I'm sorry, we might be answering 6 questions for each one you asked. We're just excited to have this conversation. As you can imagine through the hearing, as other parties have been making, I've been getting a lot of feedback from members, and this was one that they really took issue with, that they were somehow targeting lower speeds. And it really is, as Ian said, it's just they can't see a way to put a package in the market that looks credible. They don't want to embarrass themselves almost. So the economics right now, because of the CBB component, are really holding up. So the answer to your question is no.
Thank you. Yeah, if you'd only answered no, I think that would have been too little. So they were long answers, but it's exactly the conversation we need to have. So I'm glad we're having it. And believe it or not, I'm going to stay on pricing and costing even further. So you have said that incumbents are either engaged in cost pricing that has anti-competitive effects, or the current wholesale rates are too high. I think, to be honest, there's actually at least one other option, because I've been surprised this week that there hasn't been dispute that incumbents are pricing their retail offers below cost. I think most people have admitted that that is the case. But their argument has been that that's not anti-competitive, that is in fact extremely competitive behavior. The reason they're pricing below cost is because that's what they need to do to compete in the market, and they're putting services out there that customers like. How would you respond to that notion of yes, the retail price is below cost, but no, that is not anti-competitive.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that. Well, I guess there's a difference between short run and long run. But the short answer is if firms are pricing below costs on a persistent basis, that is anti-competitive. But in terms of the costs and benefits to consumers and to competition, I would make a distinction between short run and long run. In the short run, yes, consumers are getting a good deal. They basically got subsidized for the services they purchase because prices are below costs. But in the long run, these practices are anti-competitive because that have the effects of driving out competitors. And when a firm is pricing below cost on a sustained basis, if it's a short term for a very limited period of time, then that's loss leading for promotional services and so on. But so I'm talking about if this is done over a sustained period of time, then the effects can be driving out competitors, and in the long run, there will be the market will become a less competitive place, and that in turn will allow the large firm, typically it's the dominant firms that would engage in these practices, allow them to raise prices in the long run. So even though in the short run it looks like a great thing, but in the long run it's detrimental to competition.
So how do we explain to consumers that we need to keep rates high in the short term so that in the long term there's a prospect of them having low rates? Because there are, and I appreciate and I do understand the argument. I just really want to flesh it out some more because there are people who want low rates now, and that's a very understandable position.
Right. I guess my response is prices are signals to firms, and it should reflect costs because that's how in a market economy resources are allocated properly. So when prices are below costs, then that distorts the market. Now, I understand that that's a very academic answer and doesn't really answer your question, but maybe I'll let my colleagues answer from the practical perspective.
So practically speaking, if below-cost pricing is allowed to persist for a period of time, the competitive conditions will diminish, and society will be worse off if you measure it over a longer period. So yes, I may enjoy getting a really good deal today, but if the price of that is that I'm going to have fewer choices and higher prices in the future, I have to ask myself, well, is that really what the regulator wants? The other part of that is when you measure that against a wholesale rates that are pinned sort of at excessively high values, it's a double whammy for competition. So you really have to look at both sides of it, and I think that's partly why it's important for you to do the benchmarking as well. Not only is it a good discipline on wholesale rates, but I think you may want to pursue this issue of below-cost pricing to see how persistent it is in the market over time to make sure that we don't reach that condition that we don't want to reach, as opposed to short-term promotions.
Thank you. So in addition to the short-term aspect of it, are you seeing evidence that those promotional prices are being wielded in a targeted fashion? So Beanfield was in front of us earlier in the week, and they certainly had some examples of very targeted promotional pricing.
I have certainly had several of our members approach us. Several have, built their own facilities, for instance, in MDUs, which has been a target similar to Beanfield. And they have seen that targeting where, that building that now has this competitor seemingly has a great rate, but the building across the street does not. We've certainly seen a lot of targeting. Ian, if you want to.
Yeah, I want to be careful here. I don't think it's signaling out or a particular operator. I think it's targeting retail rates to a change in market condition. Didn't have competition yesterday, have competition today. I'm going to decrease my retail rates. I think that's good for consumers, but but it could feel like a single operator targeting another, but I think it's more just a retail strategy of when competition shows up, how do we behave? And I guess the interesting question for you folks to grapple with is that an appropriate market response, or do we want to see all Canadians benefiting from competition, not just those that have access to it?
Have we had enough time in any of those cycles to see the full circle? So competitor comes into the market, incumbent responds by driving down price, competitor has to exit the market either through acquisition or some other unfortunate circumstance, and the price gets raised. Have we had enough time to go through that full cycle? Have you observed that yet?
Well, it can actually be a little more subtle than that. And I also pay bills, you know, and I've seen in days when I've had incumbent services, you get a great deal, but there's always a little bit of a fine print that they can still increase the basic cost of this or that throughout the promotional period. And then there's this bill creep. So on the one hand, they start out that way. Then when you threaten to leave, they'll ratchet it down again. So it is a very finely tuned and targeted type of behavior that persists over multiple years. There's no question about that. I mean, as I said, I've experienced it as a consumer, and I think a lot of us have. But these promotions aren't temporary things that go away. They're very persistent. Now, they do try to take a bit of advantage to creep it back up, but they're long-term. You know, they'll lock you in for a year or two on a so-called good deal. And then, of course, there's also the cross-subsidy that's available to them through the bundle. And now, in the case of the national carriers, we've added wireless to that as well, which, you know, under the current framework, very few competitors have access to. So there are all these tools they have to do this rejigging in the market.
And before I ask Ian, you know, it's not that, again, our members are not able to compete with short-term promos, but we've seen some of these rates, such as that Videotron showed yesterday for fiber access. They seem to have been persistent for years. Yet, if for our member to offer it, as they showed in that demonstration, to lose $1,000 per subscriber just on the access and CBB portion, not including any of your network interconnection, something seems wrong there. Ian, did you, on the, well,
Yeah, I think your own data shows that prices are higher in Alberta and BC, and that competition is lower. And we heard folks talking about in the last 3 months since Videotron has showed up, you know, rates are coming down. So I think you see the market reacting to more competition. I appreciated Bell saying the other day that these small operators are the ones that have been holding back and doing market discipline. I think it was Bell that said that. Yeah. So I think it's just, it can't, and maybe Dr. Chen can weigh into this a wee bit, but it's not just 2 or 3 in the market that is the one that disciplines rates. It's when there's more than that on a sustained basis. You talked about people leaving the market. I think as a business person, you look at risk. I talked about the risk of onboarding a customer at a gig that my wholesale input costs are going to go to $400 within 6 years. That's a risky decision to make. I don't necessarily want to go acquire those customers. And regulatory risk is a big piece of this business. And signals without final rates, you know, repeated multi-year processes to get to a final rate after a CRTC process, a decision, appeals to various organizations. It induces risk. And for some people that have left the market, they just said, I don't see the tea leaves where I'm going to have a long-term sustainable business. I think that's some of the reasons why they've left the business.
Okay, you gave me a couple of good segues there, but I think I'll turn first to my questions about who has access to the wholesale service. So who is it that's allowed to exert that discipline? So in your submission, you noted the competitive advantage that Bell, Rogers, and TELUS have by virtue of their size, the synergies, the bundling you've talked about even this morning. You put those forwards as reasons that they should not be permitted to have wholesale access. The other side of the coin might be to argue that those are features that make them extremely strong competitors, very well positioned to put high-quality, low-cost services into the marketplace. So how do you respond to that argument that all the things you say should preclude them from having access actually make them exactly the type of strong competitors that could really deliver competitive choice?
Well, I'll let Chris answer this, but I'll just add one item on the restrictions that, your Goldilocks question, all that practice, and I missed one point that I wanted to make, which is we don't put these restrictions lightly. We've, for decades, tried to ask you to remove barriers to competition. So when the Competition Bureau raised these issues, we did a lot of soul searching. And again, as I go back to, we look at this as trying to find a balance to ensure that there are facilities being built. We can't have service-based competition without the facilities themselves. And we are the first to say that you need to find ways to encourage investment. So I'll let Chris kind of get into the nitty-gritty on that.
Thanks. So in terms of there are two restrictions, as we've said. One is it would apply everywhere and would restrict Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. Why is that important? Well, I start with the premise that in your own wireless wholesale framework decision, you made a finding that Bell, TELUS, and Rogers shouldn't be able to use MVNO on each other's networks because of the market power they have. So it is a natural extension of that policy to apply it nationwide because services are bundled. When you end up having a carrier being able to obtain access on another incumbent's network, wherever it might be in the country, you're giving them the opportunity to provide a complete bundle. And so now they're able to exercise the same market power you found that they had in the wireless market through the bundle with all the cross-subsidies entailed in that. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ziki to explain some other related matters shortly. But before that, let's go to the in-territory restriction. That one is really designed to do a couple of things. One, to deal with the concern around investment incentives. We don't think that in terms of any material impact on incumbent investment incentives, independent service-based competitors' activities really affect that one way or another. However, we do acknowledge that it's quite possible that incumbents with their resources and market power having access to each other's facilities in territory could do that. So if you want to guard against that and have some headroom in case you're not exactly at the right place in the Goldilocks zone, and if you don't want to have to give people regulatory holidays, this is a very good market discipline to employ. And since in the past, independent service-based competitors did impose price discipline, and I think that was actually admitted by a couple of the incumbents in this proceeding, you'll still get the benefit of that.
Before we go to the professor, I just want to make sure. So I think your argument is that by virtue of the ability to provide the bundle, even companies that don't have a facilities-based wireline infrastructure can exert market power across the country. So you're agreeing with the Bell position that TELUS is not, I think Bell described TELUS as not being a plucky upstart.
Yeah.
Okay, and then, sorry, again, before we go to the professor,
sure.
Because you did make a special case with Videotron, your recommendations apply differently to them. Could you explain again a bit the distinction between that case?
Sure, happy to do that. Well, we think they're in a bit of a different position. One, because they are still a regional carrier that's developing. And again, we go back to your own wireless decision. You didn't find it necessary to prevent Videotron from providing MVNO access to anybody. It was only the big three, and you did that because you recognized they had a disproportionate degree of market power. It may be that in some years Videotron's position changes, but we're here today, and until the next wholesale review, for now we're content with the restriction that we've proposed. We think it's properly calibrated based on current market conditions and your own findings.
And another thing, just to add, definitely we when you try to find the line, we based it on your own decision. But, you know, Videotron is still obviously with their Freedom Mobiles in their infancy. Our members have had no success in negotiating any MVNO offers in any bit with the big three. Maybe there's a bit of hope as we see what we saw in the US many years ago with T-Mobile trying to move up against the incumbents, and our hope is that they may be more open to such arrangements. So I don't think we'd want to put a restriction on their ability to grow their national network at this point.
Thank you. Sorry, Professor, I jumped in ahead of you. Did you want to comment?
No. Actually, this is a good place for me to put my point in. I get the point I would make is actually from the Competition Bureau's comments on the issue of incumbent access to wholesale regulatory framework. I generally agree with their analysis. So basically, they outlined the potential benefits and also the potential risks of such incumbent use. And on the benefit side, one of them, yes, indeed, they would allow incumbents to offer services that they would otherwise may not be able to in other parts of the country, assuming it's out of territory use. And I guess that relates to your question about the incumbent's ability to actually be a strong competitor. But the point I want to add is, will they? Yes, they have competitive advantages. If they really want to compete hard, they can stir things up quite a bit. But will they? And that's where the Competition Bureau's other point comes in, and I think it's an important one, and that is the risk of increase the risk of coordinated behavior. So we are already in a very concentrated market, and the incumbents are already in what we economists call multi-market contact, which further kind of facilitates the coordinated behavior, and allowing them to use each other's facilities out of territory, that basically adds another layer of contacts. And so the risk of further enhancing or facilitating coordinated behavior, in my view, is very high. And I think that's kind of the point the Competition Bureau, at least they say increased risk of coordinated behavior. And so if I were to bet, then, well, they could use this to further facilitate their coordinated behavior, or they are going to use this to compete really hard against each other in the other facility-based competitors' territories. And I would bet that it's actually the risk to coordinated behavior is a lot higher than the possibility of they use that as a way to compete aggressively.
I just think the final point on that is our view behind this was it allows some incrementalism from the commission. You know, it's easier for you to come back and remove that restriction down the road, whereas if there's unintended consequences by this Wild West, I guess, scenario, it's always harder to put it back. So I think, as we've said before, there's a bit of fragility right now in the service-based competitor. We've seen an extreme decline in the number of our competitors as acquired, and we think this just allows us, for you to nurture that and allow us to kind of regain strength in the long term.
Thank you. Those answers addressed it through a lot of lenses. I appreciate that. I've got two more topics I want to cover quickly. The first one is the recent flurry of acquisitions. Maybe Mr. Stevens and Mr. Anderson, since you're in the business, I'd be particularly interested in your views. What's going on with the acquisitions, really from a business owner lens? Are people exiting because they're getting a good offer? And is that valuation a reflection of a growing business? Is that a deliberate effort to take out competitors from the market? What's the dynamic as a business owner and with the acquisitions?
I'll try and take your hand to short and quick. So there's a few points I'd highlight. So the first is, you know, as has been said, these were healthy companies. They were long-standing companies. They'd brought a lot of innovation. They'd built out platforms. And yes, as someone said, there were high valuations, because I think it just speaks to breaking the myth that somehow all we are resellers who buy 2 4s and sell them as 6-packs. There's a lot of innovation, systems and technology and people that we invest to build these businesses, and they're not easy to build overnight. which is why I think some of these incumbents saw an opportunity to expand their platform, to acquire these technologies. So I think it's first just a validation of some of the innovation and technology we bring. But if we take a step back and I highlight the fact, we've already kind of hit it, there's been fiber mandate almost since 2016, and there's no credible path, there's no final rates, configurations have been done, and the only access is going to take years to build out. You've got no rates right now that, at least from our standpoint, are just and reasonable on the FTTN side. You have the concerns that Ian said with the growing rates, and some of these companies had built a lot of innovations and technologies that were value. I think in my discussions with many of them, they just didn't see a path forward. They had a high value offer, and they just made a smart business decision.
Mr. Stevens, did you want
Yeah,
to
I
add
don't
anything?
really want to add a lot to that. I talked a wee bit about risk profile and looking forward and risk-adjusted return on investment. When an incumbent can take an existing operation and suck it right in onto into their lines of EBITDA, it's good for the incumbent to make the decision, and the wholesaler, the service-based competitor, was able to exit at a time when they felt their risk was high. So I think it made a lot of sense for them at that time, and things may have changed now that we're sitting here today and we have access in theory to fiber and starting May 7th, but that was then and this is now.
And back then, I guess the most important signal, I'm not aware of any service-based competitor that sold to a non-incumbent. It wasn't like you saw someone trying to aggregate or, consolidation within the service-based. I think that's the signal you're looking for, that there was just these smart, long-term industry players just didn't see path forward.
But maybe to add to that, I'm not really concerned that somebody sells in the industry. I don't see that as an issue at all. What I'm super concerned about is who's coming in, who's building businesses within the industry. And that, to me, is the bigger sign of a systemic problem. It's natural that an entrepreneur builds a business. Entrepreneurs aren't really necessarily great at running businesses, they like building. But nobody's come in to entrepreneurial build a new business and create huge market share. That's, to me, the biggest concern that I have as an operator.
Great. Thank you for your on-the-ground perspective. It's very valuable. And Mr. Anderson, you guessed my last question. You started to answer it. I really did want to dig into service differentiation. Is there anything, I know you talked about being more than just buying 2-4s and selling 6-packs. Is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of kind of the unique value proposition that cnoc members provide customers?
Well, like I said, I feel like that was validated by a lot of the incumbent comments earlier, but we do see a wide variety of business models, even in the constraints that we have, in the models that we have. We've certainly saw, we felt we led the unlimited usage argument. That's actually how cnoc formed, when there was a bit of a battle to try and stop that. We've seen a lot of our members try and focus on the work from home and the growing demand on that. When before COVID, home internet was seen as a way to just watch your Netflix. Now it's an operational. So a lot of members invested in technology to allow for carrier diversity, higher availability, the ability to have cellular backup, trying to do more transparent pricing. It was mentioned yesterday, Oxio built a digital platform that allowed almost all their interactions without any human, just all through SMS and text, and that had a great update. We've seen a lot of developments in terms of TV platforms, such as the River TV platform and Distributel ones. A lot of ours work in terms of smart home, security, and a lot of them also focus on support. Everybody's connected, but everybody has different needs, and not everybody likes to work with a large multi-billion-dollar company. And there's nothing wrong with those companies, but some people want that more personalized service. They want that high touch. Our business is going into businesses and taking care of much further in than the standard organizations will. And that's just what we've seen on the existing frameworks. I think, at least from my standpoint, there's a lot of excitement with fiber when you have these copious amounts of bandwidth symmetrically with high availability, that some of the innovation we're yet to see. So we're excited for that.
Great. Thank you for answering all my questions, and thank you, Chair, for giving me the time to ask them all.
Thank you very much. We will go over to Commissioner Naidu next.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here today. Earlier this week, TELUS said within the last year that it turned down its copper network in 14 of its key geographic areas. And they said that they worked with their wholesale customers to provide them with alternatives. Could you talk about your members' experience when incumbents decommission copper? Have your members been offered alternatives? And what would the rates for those alternatives be? Are they the same for copper access?
So I can start, because certainly my organization has faced this. We are in the TELUS territory, and just this week got our list of back half of 2024 decommissioning. These sites will be, your customer will be removed from our copper platform. It's a big challenge, because again, it goes back to that addressable market. You know, as we try and turn up new customers, where customers move, we're blocked from access because we don't have access to that fiber platform. And the general accommodation is to give us access to a retail package. And while we appreciate that's better than a complete cutoff, it removes a lot of the innovation and differentiation that we just spoke of. So I guess that would be my initial response. I don't know if you want to speak in the Ontario.
Yes, well, Ontario Bell shared with you their strategy, which is just leave the old copper in for a while they put fiber into the house right beside them, and they leave the copper running. But they've also shared, I think it was their, I think when they're talking to shareholders a few weeks ago, they mentioned they're looking at turning off 100 wire centers or COs and turning the copper off entirely. And we don't want decommissioning to be stopped. We embrace the concept of decommissioning the old infrastructure. It's prone to it's old, therefore its maintenance is an issue. It doesn't have service attributes that necessarily meet consumers today. What we're really after is access to the fiber replacement ahead of the customer getting turned off, giving us a chance to migrate our customers from an existing platform over to a next generation platform. And we really don't have that in the Bell territory or when Rogers does a fiber upgrade, but we do have a commercial solution when TELUS is decommissioning copper. And I would say, I'd echo Paul's comments, it's gone from something that we have much more control over in terms of how we route our customers, how we authenticate our customers, how IPs are assigned, to something that it is a retail service, and it takes a lot of our service attributes away.
Yeah, in order to accommodate that, when we're given a retail circuit, we have to dispatch a tech, ship new equipment, because we now have to tunnel the customer back to our network in a B2B play. Again, we can make it work. We're agile, we're pivot, and we're at least happy to have some ability to access our existing customers. But it's a big concern. But I do want to echo what Ian said. We're not trying to say here, hold on to the copper networks. In fact, it sounds like TELUS, as they've said, hinted that they're nearly there, and I think Bell said explicitly they're not putting new customers on copper where they have fiber facilities. And our concern just is the longevity of those networks, the reliability that our customers are having. And I'm not trying to suggest it's a malice that this is intentional, but how much investment is going into those copper networks where only a couple of people on the street are being served by wholesale customers. I think we heard yesterday that they're harvesting DSLAMs to try and keep that network alive. It doesn't really fill your customers with a lot of confidence.
But customers losing access to choice when that happens, because we don't have the option to bring fiber as an alternative.
Would access to aggregated FTTP address your concerns about ILEC copper decommissioning? And it sounds like you're saying that copper networks are old, and it sounds almost like you're saying that they're not that valuable to you. Can you just...
Well, they're valuable to us because it's the only way. So that's a lot of value, because a lot is made about fiber and speed, and that's certainly important. Certainly fiber is going to give access to higher speeds, and we're excited about that. But I think we keep coming back to it. It's also about access. When a customer who's long-term with us, who wants to stay with us, and I have to say, I have zero speed for you. I have no way to get in there because the copper has been removed. If it's a greenfield deployment, they're not putting the copper in. So if you're talking about a residential and MDU or a commercial, any of these, smart centers that pop up, we're locked out from that standpoint. So the answer to your question, because I know we should be shorter, is yes, that solves the problem, and I think you'd see a lot of the other issue that's going to solve is I guess this asymmetry, because there is a lot of load on the cable networks because, there was a comment that X percent of customers are under 300. Well, I can tell you 100% of my customers on the ILEC are below 300 megs, because it's 50 megs is about the highest speed you're going to get on those facilities. I think Chris just wanted, if you don't mind, want to sneak in one point on the last question, though.
Yeah. So just on the thing, there is a difference in approach, I think, like you heard, between TELUS and Bell. Bell is very much all or nothing. Now, they do say, and I think they're well-intentioned in this regard, although we've had some issues, that they don't want to touch the copper of wholesale customers. But there's also an inherent inefficiency in that, because as they're going around and wiring neighborhoods, it's kind of inefficient for them to leave it in, but it's a consequence of their unwillingness to allow any kind of access to fiber to wholesale customers. The other point is that when it comes to the cable carriers, they seem to be much more interested, generally speaking, in leveraging their existing facilities, but they also do some decommissioning, especially in the areas of MDUs, multiple unit buildings. And so overnight, you can end up with situations where a building that you might have had access to the day before, suddenly you can't access. So that's been happening as well, because when they replace, that tends to be a lot of their focus. The rest of their focus is on greenfield. A lot of their other focus is on greenfield fiber deployments.
And my last point on the copper issue is, if aggregated was put in similar where we would have access to those service attributes. And I can't underscore how important that is to differentiate and innovate, which, I know there's a pressure to make sure that we're offering that. cnoc is of the view that we have no problem with a orderly transition. So we know that both the two major ILECs at least want to pull their copper out for the reasons they stated, and we would have no issue working with them to have a migration plan to move our customers off their copper network and onto fiber where they have fiber available.
And the Commission has addressed this as far back as '94. It issued a letter decision, 9411, where it talked about the requirement for incumbents to provide notification of network changes. So that framework can easily be used so that they can give a 6-month notification period and let everyone prepare for that.
Thank you very much. Can you expand on your claim that, and I'm quoting here, evidence shows incumbent deployments are pushing independent ISPs from previously served territories? What do you mean by that, and what evidence specifically are you referring to?
So could you just repeat the question? I apologize.
Yeah, can you expand on your claim that evidence shows incumbent deployments are pushing independent ISPs from previously served territories? Just wondering what you mean by that.
I think that just goes to the point we've been making on the shrinking footprint, that, every new MDU in this country is probably fiber fed. And by the way, not a risky investment too. The providers are literally tripping over each other trying to get in, as you probably heard from Beanfield. Every greenfield is fiber, and of course, this decommissioning is occurring. And, where our members used to be serve in all regions, we're now seeing huge pockets where there's just no service. It just makes it hard when, even just one side of a street, because it's now all fiber fed, we have no access to. It makes it very hard to market, to target, when you have this more and more disjointed groups. So I think the evidence is itself what the incumbents have said. They are moving to fiber. They are pulling out copper in a lot of areas, and we don't have access to that.
No, it's just that when fiber goes out, that previously addressable premise is no longer on the list of addressable premises.
It's as simple as that.
Thank you very much. You seem to be suggesting that previously established point of interconnection locations be changed. So I'm wondering how cnoc suggests that the costs of POI relocation should be recovered, who should incur those costs of the associated POI moves, and what would the impact be to ISPs who choose not to move and would prefer to remain in the existing location?
Sorry, are you talking from a move from disaggregated to aggregated, or in the aggregated model where a provider moves a POI?
Both. We can just explore that.
Sure.
Sure. So I guess our position is that the aggregated POIs should be on a provincial or a multi-provincial, capture a provincial or multi-provincial footprint. Kind of maybe walk through the country a wee bit. In Bell, in MTS, in Ontario, Quebec, on the East Coast, Bell has one spot in each market that you can go to pick up those markets, as does, I'm going to say Rogers does, but there's a few edge cases. Rogers does a very similar thing in Ontario, Quebec. They already have these points of interconnection. We're just suggesting for fiber to the prem that the services are brought to those existing points of interconnection. In the West, Shaw has 11 points of interconnection across a few provinces, and that's their aggregated model today, and it feels very disaggregated from an operator perspective. We're suggesting that they pick one point of interconnection by province or group of provinces, and I guess as part of the costing process is to include the cost of bringing the services from those points of interconnection to a common one. So then there's the issue of, what about the person that's at the wrong POI? And that applies to disaggregated. Why? And when there's a disaggregated model, how do you do the orderly transition? I don't think we have a clear path forward on a case-by-case basis, and they should be handled on a case-by-case basis of when you're sitting at the wrong POI. And
so I just add, a general principle, we're not trying to impede these operators from evolving their networks and changing their networks. We've seen that in fiber deployment, that the original CO model, where you had to get very close to the customer because of the limitations of copper, is starting to disappear, and they may be aggregating themselves a bit more even in their internal networks. I think there's already frameworks which Chris can speak of in terms of just how that should do. I think my main message is the commission just needs to make sure that that's natural network evolution and not some attempt to make it more difficult for competitors to access, given that in some of the regions, especially out of Ontario and Quebec, there aren't these more logical interconnection points that also attract a lot of transport. In the Ontario market, you tend to have your aggregation points in Toronto, and there's just well-established transport networks and data centers and colos that allow you to access those interconnection points. And in Quebec, they're in Montreal. After you get out of that region, it starts to get trickier, and the transport options are obviously more limited. So I think that's our concern. I'm going to let Chris kind of add just on some of how the costs can be recovered.
Yeah, so before I do that, I want to just stress that in particular in Shaw's territory, which covers BC, Alberta, and part of Saskatchewan, we have, even in the aggregated model, these 11 POIs. And, one of the remedies to help boost competition in the West would be to really aggregate that more heavily into 1, 2, or 3 POIs, one per province, or even more so. There's no reason for that not to be possible now that there are linkages, we're sure, between all the different parts of the Shaw networks. They're not sort of islands. In terms of where to locate them, we've seen the extreme example in Atlantic Canada of Eastlink putting a POI 30-some kilometers outside of the metro area and basically holding the TPIA customers hostage because they are the only ones that can provide a transport link at rates that are not great. And it's been the subject of some applications before the commission which have been addressed, but the problem still persists. So Of course, we want network operators to be free to design their own networks, but in doing so, there should be a rule that when they establish a POI, first of all, they establish it in the manner we've described, and in the case of Shaw, it may be necessary to collapse them, and that they also situate them at an area where there is some competitive transport available, so that they don't end up basically leveraging market power associated with their location to bind people to only one competitive option. In terms of cost recovery, you know, when the co-location regime decades ago came into being, there was a method to apportion the costs among different entrants occupying the CO. And we think that sort of formula in which the cost can be apportioned among the parties that take advantage of the POIs could be established. Of course, being very careful to ensure that the costs are just and reasonable and according to phase 2.
All right, those are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Maybe at this point I can just check in with you. I think we probably have about 20 minutes or so of additional questions. Did you want to take a break or should we keep going?
I'll follow the line and say we're always in your hands, so we're happy to keep going.
Okay, well, we'll keep going and see how that goes. I will turn things over to Commissioner Desmond.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions really for clarification. In November, of course, the Commission granted temporary and expedited access to the Bell and Telus FTTP networks in Ontario and Quebec by May. Can you speak to your members' plans to use that access? Maybe just give a bit more detail in terms of.
Yeah, well, I can speak. I can speak to mine. We have orders queued and ready for May 7th, 9 a.m. We're certainly concerned about the rates, but we, as I said, have footprint that we want to get back access to. And I know that other members I've spoken to are also, they're cautious, but they're trying to, you know, especially where they have bundles and other areas where they can try and keep customers that have been sticking with them for some time saying, but I keep getting my knock on the door from incumbent A or B. They're offering me these speeds. I'd love to stay with you. I love your service. I love what you've done. I've been a customer a long time. So I think the focus will certainly be there. Ian, did you want to have maybe your plans?
All right, so we're ready to go. Well, not quite ready to go. The teams are running around, getting retail rates ready, order process testing, kind of figuring out the equipment that has to go. So our members are all excited about access to this. Like Paul, we've got customers who are desperate for higher speeds and have either, we've figured other ways to solve their problems and we're looking forward to it. I was very encouraged when Mr. Daniels shared yesterday, Wednesday,
Yes,
that they're on track and that they're not going to miss that date.
Okay, thank you. We also heard this week that from the incumbents who talk about the steps they need to take to put the FTTP service in place as quickly as possible. And we've heard the steps that are required and the time frame from different parties in terms of how long it will take to roll this out. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that and whether those timeframes, in your view, are appropriate?
That's a tough question. I think we've stressed that the time that it's taken is been detrimental and that speed is of the essence, which is why we're urging you to maybe even just break up your decision, and if that means setting the policy first, that who will be mandated, and directing them to start building those networks while rates and other issues are sorted out, that would be our preference, because we've heard this 6 months, 12 months and longer. It seems very long, given that we're talking about using, at least from what we see in the tariffs file, they seem to all be making, for the most part, the use of their existing aggregated networks. We're already interconnected there. And in some cases, it's actually about them, at least from a network perspective, stopping the blocks they've put on. We've heard that when incumbents have rolled out their FTTP networks, it's really that they put items in their network to stop the FTTP traffic, because in their network, they don't normally always distinguish between FTTP and the legacy once it starts seeing their aggregation. So we don't believe the network itself that there's major work. There's definitely work. We're not saying it's an overnight thing. And we would just urge you to put pressure on these IT systems and training. You know, the commission has had this interim finding for some time. Our hope is that they've put some thought into how this deploys, but we would urge as quick as possible, please.
And the other part of that will be to look after the rate component, because the rates are excessive. So hopefully those will get adjusted quickly and retroactively.
Okay, thank you. And we also heard from Bell, their suggestion that while the fiber to the node services can continue, they would like to see the rates frozen for the FTTN services. TELUS, of course, suggested that the FTTN service be discontinued. So I'd again like to hear your views on those two proposals.
I think so I'll just talk high level that we touched on. We're concerned that the rates aren't right now just, as has been found, but, you know, I think our members want to not impede Canada's development of fiber networks, so we understand that access to fiber may see services like FTTN get turned down. We highlight what we said earlier. It's got to be done orderly. We got to make sure customers aren't left behind, especially given the importance of internet in daily lives in a work from home situation. But I think at a high level, we understand that that might be next steps. I'll turn over to Chris on the specifics of the freeze and the regulatory stuff.
So we think that Bell has made a legitimate case for rate freezing in FTTN based on the two conditions the commission has set out, which are that it's not a growth technology and that they have a reasonably minimal number of users. We caution not extending that to other ILECs until they demonstrate that they've met those conditions. In the case of the cable carriers, they're not really converting a lot of their existing plants, so that should certainly not apply to their FTTN, which is their hybrid fiber coax.
Sorry, yes, I'd like to clarify my answer. It was focused on the ILEC because FTTN in my world is more copper. We think of TPIA when we think of cables. I would just echo what Chris said.
No, thank you. So you're okay, I guess, with respect to the Bell proposal, but with other incumbents, you'd want to have additional information?
Yeah, I mean, because Bell put their number on the record, and that seemed like a reasonable number to us, at which point they can freeze rates, but we don't really have numbers for TELUS or SaskTel or.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you very much. You know what, maybe just before I jump into my questions, can we just maybe deal with an undertaking, if that's okay?
Sure. Staff and I have been chatting while the discussion has continued. So in your discussion with Commissioner Naidu about copper decommissioning, you stated that members have been receiving notices of copper decommissioning and disconnection notices and have been offered alternatives by the incumbents. Could you undertake to provide the Commission any copies of those notices and any evidence of the alternatives that you've been offered?
Given that's undertaken, I'll turn it over to
Yeah.
Chris.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, that was easy.
Okay. Well, the difficulty with going last is that we've covered a lot of ground. So I just have a few questions, and I hope they don't overlap too much, although there will be a little bit of overlap with what you've already discussed with the panel. So perhaps starting with a very high-level question. We heard from Bell earlier this week that the market has never been more competitive. We heard from Rogers yesterday that there is intense competition, but you paint a different picture, and you have said that there is an affordability and competition crisis in Canadian telecommunications. You said that this morning in your opening remarks. You heard as well earlier this week from PIAC, Open Media, Manitoba Coalition, the kinds of concerns that that consumers have with respect to their internet services, ranging from choice, prices, customer service, and them asking for more competition. Can you just comment on that?
Well, I don't think it'll come as a surprise I don't agree in the sense of in the markets where we're now locked out, we're not seeing that. Where we still have access, we're still vibrantly providing that competition. You know, we still have customers who come to us all the time looking for our services. I just find it just a little disingenuous to say that, you know, when we've seen only facilities-based competition in an area, that's what Canadians are looking for. You know, we've seen when conditions were better that, you know, almost 10% of Canadians or businesses were choosing us. And I think that was showing that the facilities-based competition wasn't doing what it needs to do.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Can I?
Oh,
Sorry.
absolutely.
Yeah, I would just, okay. I guess I'll address the price specifically. So the competition is multidimensional. There's investments, quality of services, and also prices. I think a big part of the incumbent's argument it was if you look at the prices, quality-adjusted prices, like speed-adjusted prices have been falling over time and so on and so forth. And that is true. Prices have been falling. But prices fall may be due to different reasons. And in this industry, I think a big component is technological progress. So, so the issue of market power from a purely academic perspective, one way to measure market power is to look at the price-cost margin, and that in turn it gives us a sense of whether they are earning super competitive returns. But that is a fairly data-intensive exercise if we try to measure in that way. But then another less data-intensive but useful way is to look at across internationally. And there's been quite a few international comparisons done. The incumbents produce their own reports, but in my report, I pointed out that there are, in my view, flaws in these analyses that make their conclusions questionable. So I would put more faith in the independent studies that are not done by incumbents. And specifically with regard to price, I would like to point to the FCC study, the US FCC study. Actually, they did two studies, one in 2020 and the other is 22. And so if you look at Canada's ranking in between these 2 years, despite the fact that prices have been falling, but our international ranking actually has fallen. In other words, relative to the other countries, we are becoming more expensive, not less expensive. So that would be one data point I would point to, indicating that the falling prices, yes, but relative to our international peers, they haven't fallen enough.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Chen. And I'm wondering if I could perhaps pick up on a point you just made about efficiency, because Tech Savvy will be up this afternoon. They've talked about, and I know they will speak to this today, they've talked about the incumbents' costs decreasing and how wholesale competitors are not realizing those same cost savings. And I'm just wondering if you can walk us through that in a little bit of detail.
So that is part of the problem with, you know, multi-year studies, is that we haven't figured out a way how to loop back and do a sanity check on the phase 2 results over time and see how the market rates, the costs of the incumbents are actually changing over time. That is, you know, one of the couple of flaws that I see right now that's fairly major, and it manifests probably the most in the CBB rate we discussed. The other problem is how the you know, the Commission deals with information asymmetry issues, but I know that's a different problem. But this particular one, we do need to find a way to loop back and make sure that wholesale rates are adjusted more than, you know, once every 5, 10, 15 years. That is a problem. We need to follow the trends in technological improvement and cost declines.
Yeah, that CBB or capacity-based billing, and you know, cnoc, just through the example, that's a real challenge, and that we need more responsiveness, because certainly anyone who looks at transport costs and the cost of building transport networks, the costs have you know, fallen quite significantly, yet that rate has not been adjusted in many years. And as you see that Moore's law of traffic growing, it's putting more and more pressure. So I think that would be our main message to you in that item.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a couple more questions. One is around the quality of service issues that you talked about. And Videotron talked about this as well. You've talked about the issues facing the competitors you call them the giant incumbents. With respect to things like customer onboarding, can you just talk to us a little bit more about what those quality of service issues, what impact that has on consumers?
On consumers, well, that's, as they say, a great question. So, we've submitted a very long list, and I wouldn't try and go through them. But there are real challenges, especially when it comes to the asymmetry of what maybe a retail customer of an incumbent has versus what we have. And it can be simple as stuff as just scheduling, if this customer's having service and we need to arrange a dispatch, when they deal with the incumbent, they might have access to the retail will have access to a tool that can tell them in real time, we'll have someone out there tomorrow. Whereas we sometimes have to go through a portal, wait for a response that gives us a general, and we then have to get a hold of the customer. It adds labor on our side, and it's not a good customer experience. As I said, some of the incumbents, even on ordering, don't have any kind of automated ordering. So all that ordering is done manually. There's inefficiencies in terms of how the service is designed and interconnected, our ability to manage traffic flows, and all of these have costs. And when our costs are higher, that ultimately is going to hit the consumer. So you have a cost element where the costs are driven up, but you also just have where we're trying in many cases certainly provide better customer service when you're hampered without the same symmetry as the incumbents. And then the third one probably is just in intervals, where sometimes it's a repair or an install seems to always be a little bit faster on the incumbents. And we see that sometimes on service outages where they may have an issue, we're trying to get it repaired, they call the incumbent directly, who seemingly can come quite quickly. Ian may have some more examples on that.
Yeah, I think it manifests itself in over time. We set service standards, quality of service standards years ago, and through just simple IT upgrades, the incumbents kind of leapfrog ahead in terms of what the standard of the day was to what it is today. Just something as simple as, I don't know, they're probably using SMS for dispatch or something like that. It used to be a phone call, and a long time ago it used to be two-way radio. But those delays that were part of the process years ago are still built in the processes we have today, and they've figured out. The incumbents have figured out how to pull that out, but they haven't backported that into the quality. The impact to customers is just time, delay, rework. A missed appointment means two afternoons off of work, or 2 afternoons working at home, and if you have to leave your home, you have to work with your employer to make that happen. Whereas, those happen, we believe, more on our customers than on the incumbent customers, but we can't prove it. We have anecdotes, and we have no evidence, and you have no evidence in front of you to test that and validate that. And we encourage you to reach out, ask difficult questions, and look, A to B, does this make sense? So we have anecdotes. We think there's a problem, but we can't demonstrate it.
I know Chris wants to jump in a bit, and I'd like to give that, but I would just say that one of the reasons we suggested the inquiry officer is, we've tried through CISC, and it's too slow. With respect, it's just we don't solve these issues fast enough, and when we bring it through the more traditional, application process, the problem is it bypasses that. What sometimes I think lacks is where we haven't been able to bilaterally sort out, just getting the incumbents and our members in a room, so at least we can talk these issues throughout, at least understand why they've designed that system that way before we come and bring it to the commission from an application perspective. We're hopeful that process will just yield to very more effective dialogue, and maybe some of these problems can be solved without the necessity to keep escalating from that standpoint. Chris, I know, just wants to get on the QoS regime itself.
Yeah, so there are two quality of service discussions. There's a broad one about technical and operational challenges of using the wholesale services as they're designed and with the processes that the incumbents have put in place, and that's what we're talking about in terms of the inquiry, to try and shrink the gap in understanding and hopefully increase cooperation. On the actual Q of S regime as it's narrowly exists right now, which deals with orders, installations, repair, disconnection intervals, those sorts of things, there's an evidentiary problem, and that's what I want to get to. And that's, I do in my practice, and cnoc hears in their, from their membership, all of these stories about problems. The problem is we can't get our arms around the evidence because of the way that the system the regime is presently constructed. In a normal situation where you have a complaint of undue discrimination, you're able to point to the discrimination, and then the onus shifts to the carrier to demonstrate it's not undue. In our case, because we have anecdotal evidence that's across so many different service providers, it may be a few here, a few there, we can't really get our arms around the evidence. So one of the two things we've proposed is that you require the incumbents to report on their retail numbers for the same metrics so that you can actually see if there's a discriminatory practice in going on or not. And second, that if there is, or they're not meeting their wholesale targets in a persistent manner, that there be some enforcement mechanism. In the voice world, we used to have the rate rebate plan, but when we came to doing this in the internet world, we sort of dropped that. So I encourage you to think about reinstating that. But as I say, for all the rest of the stuff, the other bucket, we think that appointing a commissioner as an inquiry officer is the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. So just for my last question, it really comes down to the point about urgency, and you've talked to my colleagues about this, and Commissioner Desmond most recently. So you've said time is of the essence. We know Tech Savvy saying it's a critical and time-sensitive proceeding. We've heard from others that it's, we're already too late. But of course, you've heard the other side of it as well. And incumbents have argued that, we should wait until they've recouped all of their investments. Can you just talk a little bit about what will happen to your members' businesses if we don't move forward with aggregated FTTP, or if we take too long to do so?
Well, the non-aggregated FTTP, I would, just simply say they will cease to exist. We will have no access to the service. There will be no commercial negotiations, any attempt at that. It's been made very clear by the incumbents they have no desire to do that. So I think you'd see that. The speed issue, it's hard to predict. We've already seen a major wave, as you've seen, of exits, and I can't underscore that those were not, for the most part, short-lived companies that just popped up. So any new entrants, which you need to see, we don't have a problem with acquisition, but we want to see new entrants. It's going to take some time, and I think that the more entrenched that we allow these incumbents to gain market share, it just becomes harder for the David and Goliath battle to try and come in and compete. Chris? Sorry, did you want to clarify? I'm sorry. No, you clarified. Oh, I'm being told I might have said non-aggregated. If you were not to mandate an aggregated solution, I apologize.
Okay,
that's why you have good counsel to keep you clean.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those answers. Thank you for answering our many, many questions. We would like to turn things back over to you for any concluding remarks.
So there are two items that I guess we just wanted to cover, if that's all right. That maybe one I'll just turn over to Ian, because there was a bit of we were very happy again to hear TELUS describe it, that they sell us lumber and we build a house, because I think we just want to underscore that, and I'd just like to go back to Head Start for a second and then conclude.
Sure. So there was a line of questioning earlier this week that talked, or evidence that was suggested that the wholesale rate of $112 against a retail rate of $120 seemed to make sense. And I just want to walk you through what we do beyond the $112. And I know you're already digging into and did a whole bunch of work, asked a lot of questions around, well, what is the real retail rate? So I really appreciate you doing that digging. But beyond that $112, let me walk you through what we do. So $112 is the access component. We talked about CBB as cash on top of that. We have to interconnect our networks with the incumbents at an AHSSPI using a network link, and that's a few more dollars a month. So that's all cash going every month to the incumbent. But that's just getting the customer connected, the home, to our network. We still have to supply hardware to the end customer in the form of router or modem. We have technology we have to deploy and rent space in our co-locations, and these are big routers, they're access routers in our colo, and power. We deploy servers for authentication. We have to connect to the internet through internet connections. We go to Chicago to do some of our stuff like that. That's not free. We add a help desk, an order desk, a sales desk, a website, HR, accounting. These regulatory lawyers actually want to get paid, a billing and provisioning platform. And this is even before we put a sign out and tried to market and win the hearts and mind of a customer. You also ask us to deliver on innovation. Innovation isn't free as well. So that's over and above all of that. This stuff isn't $112 with, there isn't room at $120 discounted retail, discounted off that, on top of the $112 to make a profit. I think that the thought of a couple of dollars between the access rate alone and the retail rate is sufficient for competitors to offer service is frankly ridiculous. And the notion, if accepted, is as much a threat to competition as the notion of prohibited access.
So the only thing I just want to state to cover that didn't kind of come up was just, there were several conditions that the ILEX, at least Bell, stated that they felt needed to be done, and frankly, some of them we agree with, which is, hearing Bell say they agree with CNOC on things, it was a new experience, but, the restrictions we agreed with in terms of who can have access and the national footprint, and we already discussed the FTTN. But the one thing that I really just want to talk about, and I know it's had some airplay, is this access holiday. And we did, when this came up, we just like the restrictions. Again, we're not big on asking for restrictions. We've generally advocated for removing them. We tried to game this out. Would this really be that bad if they had this multi-year block? And our concern really that we'd ask you to be careful on that is it's going to lead to, we believe, excessive gaming. Suddenly every MDU when built doesn't have access, and we don't see the investment risk on that if there was a head start. Seeing, just on my street alone in Toronto, where I've been built out for a few years, but they just built a cul-de-sac. So does that now get, and when does it start, and who's going to track? Is it, because we don't have access to data, do we just have to believe them when they say that period has occurred? And I think it could also lead to some unintended consequences where one incumbent sees the other one building up a street and quickly builds up the second wire because they want, again, have all wholesale access locked out. So we really just say that would be a proposal that we don't think denying Canadians access to competition for a period of time is a good idea, because we think they have other motivations. Like even in Bell's diagram that they showed you on the complexity, I noticed that down the street they're putting 5G antennas. They're motivated to build that. We've clearly heard that wireless is a big motivator for them to sell. They're going to continue to make that investment to just be able to build out their 5G networks because those antennas need to be so shortly placed. So I just wanted to give a moment on that because I know there've been a lot of airtime and others to Head Starts. I think Chris has one last item, I promise, and then we can wrap up. I apologize for taking.
So I just wanted to stress how important the rate-making process is, not just in terms of scrutinizing data, but the process itself. And in 2016, you adopted a fairly rigorous way of requiring incumbents to make sure they complied with all their requirements under Phase 2 when they provide a cost study, to provide a base case that's clean. In other words, if they want any deviations, they have to put it in a separate study and not mix it all together, and to comply with the Commission's disclosure requirements. They didn't follow that in these proceedings at all, and we would urge you to really reimpose that discipline and hold them to account and levy consequences if they don't. Thank you.
So just thank you very much again for the opportunity to come speak. Our thanks to staff, who I know have to go through extremely long, and to the youth commissioners and chair and vice chair for this dialogue. We really do appreciate the opportunity to see you. It's, you know, I know a lot gets lost in the essence of massive multi-hundred-page submissions, so to be able to talk through these issues is very important to us. I just leave you that we stress that we think that access to all Canadians is important for competition. I think we've demonstrated, including some of our competitors, incumbent competitors, have validated that we do provide value and competition to Canadians. We have a long-standing history of that all the way back to the dial-up BBB bases, as Mr. Pellado said yesterday in many cases. And we're, while there was certainly some pessimism recently, this proceeding has brought a lot of our members' optimism. I encourage you to keep at the rapid pace, and I know that policy is never fast, but we really urge you to try and move forward as fast as possible on this issue and, you know, roll this out so that all Canadians can enjoy. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, cnoc. Thank you for answering 2 hours worth of questions. We've really appreciated the discussion as well.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. We will go for a break and resume at 11:15. Thank you.